Good morning, and thank you for joining us here on Cheche. I'm your host, Uduak Amimo. Now, whether it's public protests against the National Assembly, MPs and senators quarreling, or budget deficits, the thread that links a lot of the news we're reading, listening to, and watching at the moment is public finances. Commissions created and protected by Chapter 15 of the Constitution find themselves in the fray because they will have less money to work with. And so we have, from the Constitutional Implementation Commission, the CIC Commissioner Kamotho Waiganjo. Our regular panel is back, Waiganjo of Royal Media Services and political commentator David Makali. Good morning and welcome to Cheche. So the news of the day, the news that broke last night, is that after two public protests and several meetings and much toing and froing, backing and forthing, terse words, angry words, and name-calling, that the National Assembly has finally accepted the pay package proposed by the Salaries and Remuneration Commission. Now, within the CIC, you look after public finances. What's your response to that news?
Thanks, Odwak. I think the CIC position has been very clear from the beginning. And it is informed by the very reason why the Salaries Commission was created. If you remember, in the run-up to the writing of the Constitution, there were very serious concerns about the public wage bill generally, but particularly the wage bill relating to the expenses of members of parliament. Because unlike all other civil servants, members of parliament fixed their own salaries from about 1997, and there was an outcry. So actually the principal reason why the SRC was created was actually about members of parliament. So for us, we were very clear that if there's one institution that cannot be allowed to fix its salaries, it is members of parliament. They have been given huge responsibilities by the Constitution of a budget. They cannot be allowed to use that power to benefit themselves. So it was not actually an option for members of parliament to accept or not to accept. The only institution that can adjust their salaries is the SRC. And it is good that they have come to terms with that reality. What we say, and we have said this before, is that the SRC exists to review salaries. If members of parliament are able to make a legitimate case, and for all we know they might have a legitimate case, let them present their case to that institution, let it review, look at all other considerations, but it cannot be that any public servant, including ourselves, sits down and decides how much they'll be paid. It is against good sense, it is against the constitutional order, and it is not acceptable. And it's also an insult to the people of Kenya who sat down and said, we cannot allow this to happen.
If that is the case, why are MPs not seeing it that way? It's so obvious. And they have come here, many of them, to talk to us about this matter and justify it.
You know, when something is personal and something is about your own personal benefit, you can afford, you can risk, to sometimes appear even contradictory to your own arguments, and so it is not surprising, these sort of things, these sort of considerations, these sort of contradictions, positions that don't make any logical sense. They usually happen when there's a personal benefit to a human being. It's not unique to members of parliament. I think what is unfortunate is that the place that members of parliament have been placed by the Constitution is a very senior position. I don't think Kenyans have realized the huge powers that members of parliament have been given by law. So that sort of power must be curtailed by the Constitution because it is open to abuse. And you don't want to transfer an autocracy from the executive in the past and move it to 450 autocrats. So in a sense, part of the checks of the exercise of power by members of parliament was on that issue. There are others, but that is the most obvious one and a very important
There was
one.
a claim in their arguments that by gazetting the new salaries, Serem had acted ultra vires the Constitution, that she had actually, in effect, legislated which is not part of her mandate under the Constitution. What do you make of that as a lawyer and within the CIC's implementation mandate yourselves?
I find that a very interesting argument by members of parliament, because if you read Article 230, which I think is the one that talks about the powers of the SRC, it gives the SRC the power to determine the salaries of all state officers. So the only question you need to ask is, are members of parliament state officers? Has SRC determined once it has determined the mode by which it decides to communicate that information is not provided for in the law. By the way, there's no requirement for them to gazette. They could actually just write to your employer and say, this is what we have determined, this is what you pay. So there's nothing that the SRC was doing that is outside the law. What was interesting is last year when Parliament met, they made an amendment to the SRC Act that said that all regulations made by the SRC must be approved by the National Assembly. Now, their understanding of that rule was that if these people purported to make any determination, they would do so by regulation, which would be sent to Parliament, which Parliament would approve, thereby negating the very essence of the existence of the SRC.
Yes.
But you see, there's no requirement to do so by regulation. All that the SRC is required to do is determine. Actually, they don't even have to put it in the newspapers. They just need to write to the person who pays you. And I think these sorts of discussions, the unfortunate thing is that the Parliamentary Service Commission is represented in the SRC. Has anybody asked why it was important to have Parliamentary Service Commission in the SRC? It is so that their issues can be articulated. Honorable Lawyer Ringo, who was a former chair of the PSC, sits in that commission so that he can articulate the views of members of Parliament. The Parliamentary Service Commission is a constitutional organ. They can sit in a room and agree on these issues. It is so unfortunate when you see the sort of chest thumping that was there, saying you're going to disband this, we're going to do this.
Certainly those questions were asked, but what we also saw was members of Parliament, well, members of the National Assembly, then venting their anger on the constitutional commissions, including yourselves and the Salaries and Remuneration Commission. And so we now have it was almost as if the MPs were against everybody, the Senate, governors and the commissions. How does the CIC address that, uncomfortable position of, being targeted in its work, being told that it's wasting money, being asked to account for its budgets, because we certainly heard that.
We have no problem with accounting for money. The money that we spend is public money. and it is spent after very many considerations. One of the issues that Parliament had a problem with, the National Assembly is the amount of money we spend on public adverts. And we said, listen, one of the traditions that we have had as a country is to keep information away from Kenyans. All these disagreements, why do you bring them out in the open? And we kept saying, these disagreements we have as public servants. These are not private disagreements. These are public disagreements. And it is important that Kenyans understand what are the issues. And if we don't publish this, what happens is that they are then reported as news. And news, with all respect to good journalists, is that they'll pick sometimes what is most controversial, and sometimes the argument as to why you got there is not presented. So sometimes we have to present the whole argument so that people see we're not just opposing members of Parliament. For example, we used to tell them, we actually have no view on whether you're underpaid or overpaid. We don't know. It's not our business. All we are saying is whatever it is you're paid, there's a process. So these sort of disagreements between ourselves and institutions, they are not surprising. They are natural because we obviously have different mandates and there will be sometimes a clash of opinions. I think what is unfortunate is if people use the power that the Constitution has given, not so much to reach a just end, but to exercise power for power's sake. When you say to an institution that because of views we are taking, we're going to slice your budget, it is not your money. This is taxpayers' money. You have a responsibility to ensure that that institution carries out its mandate, even if that mandate is, affects you prejudicially. That is a constitutional responsibility. So what we have said is we are accountable, we are audited, where we make mistakes, we'll admit them, but in the meantime, we must carry out our responsibilities. And what we ask all institutions is not to be cowed, because I know that there are institutions which have been terrified by the possibility budgets are going to be slashed. If Parliament decides today that they will not allocate the CIC money, we will go home. It's not a crisis for us as individuals, but it is the people of Kenya who take the responsibility of us not being able to carry out our mandate. It's not something that keeps us awake, worried that tomorrow we might go home.
Kamotho, there seems to be, of course, Parliament, the National Assembly degenerated to a point of personalized attacks. They went for Serem at a very personal level, questioning her competence and so forth. And her salary that she were paid herself, but you guys were paid yourselves, now you want to cut their salaries. They went for Nyachai at a personal level, questioning his competence and so forth. CIC. This, of course, was a very low, level that some MPs sank. But did you at any one point initiate discussions with the National Assembly, either through the leader, the speaker, to say, look, we need to respect each other's institutions. We have our mandate, you have yours. And these personalized attacks are not even healthy for the public and their image. Did you at any one time initiate such interventions?
By the way, you'd be surprised that we have fairly good working relations with Parliament on very many issues. We disagree on a few, but the ones we disagree on are fairly hot. But on average, we have met with the speakers not once, not twice, and agreed, by the way, in principle, that we will reduce our disagreements in the public domain. That before we reach that sort of public disagreement, we'll try and resolve it, as much as possible. Because sometimes it's also not helpful when public institutions appear not to be able to negotiate anything. So we have an agreement in principle. Unfortunately, it is not always possible to do that, because we may reach a point somewhere where the conflict of ideas is not resolvable. And at that point, we have a responsibility with the wider public to be able to say, even though Parliament is doing this, this is our position and this is the constitutional position. It is important for that, because that's the only way we maintain the public support on the Constitution, because otherwise what happens is the public starts to feel that all is lost. What was the use of this Constitution anyway? And it's important that we keep faith in the Constitution.
The deputy president had a meeting with the SRC and the PSC a few days, and they have now concluded and agreed on certain things. Are there losers and winners?
I think ultimately the winners are the people of Kenya. I think if the members of Parliament through the PSC accept to adopt the mandate and to accept the mandate of the SRC, that is a win for this country. Because this is not just about money and as to whether people won in terms of getting more money or getting less money. Yeah. It is more an issue of respecting the mandate of the institutions that we have created. And let's not forget, each of these people are appointed through Parliament. Charles Nyachai was interviewed, vetted by that same Parliament. So when did they finally realize he's become incompetent? Sarah Serem was vetted by the same Parliament. Suddenly they realize he's incompetent. And you see, if he's incompetent, he's only become incompetent because he has dealt with your salary. And in any event, if you think he's incompetent, there are provisions in the Constitution. If someone is incompetent, you commence a tribunal and show the evidence of the incompetence. If you have it, they will be sent home. We don't want anyone who's incompetent. So if Charles Cheche or Kamotho Waiganjo is incompetent, there are avenues in the law. Use them, let me go home.
They were questioning how Sarah Serem got the money she got. Because she started with not that. Who determined how much she will get? Is it not herself?
It is, but you will notice that it is not unique to Sarah. By the way, Sarah is not even, what is it called? She's not a permanent commissioner. She's a part-time commissioner. The monies that were allocated for part-time sittings are the same for everybody. It is not just for herself. It is for all the institutions that have part-time people who are sitting on part-time positions. And this is amounts per sitting. That is all that she provided for. So there's nothing unique about the SRC.
Well, no, Kamotho, what do you say? Okay, what do you say about the complaint by members of Parliament that they have been low rated? That they're number 43 among state officers, after everybody else, is a member of Parliament in the hierarchy of perception, public officers. Where do you place the member of Parliament and therefore the justification for their pay?
You see, David, I never get into the argument about whether the amount of money members of Parliament have been paid is right or wrong. That is not my expertise. I don't know the basis on which SRC made that determination. And there are very many considerations. I am sure there are very many considerations, including, remember, that members of Parliament are they who said that the standard of education for members of Parliament is nothing. You can, as long as you can read and write, you can go to Parliament. That is not the only consideration, but it is one of the considerations in assessing the whatever. But that is not my expertise. What I say is, let the institution that has that responsibility, in which you are represented, let them make that determination. And by the way, their role was not just to fix members of Parliament's salary. So the issue is not the quantum. The quantum, they may actually be right, for all I know. But let them make that case. And part of the case they would make is what you're raising, about the hierarchy and how people perceive members of Parliament. But that case needs to be made to the SRC. If they're able to make the case, their salaries can be reviewed. But it can't be them to make that determination.
Okay, we heard the MPs also threaten to pass laws exempting Kenyans or certain groups from paying taxes. So how would the CIC deal with this, where, as you've rightly pointed out, MPs are using the powers, the huge powers they have, in their personal interest?
One, I think that was more of a threat than
No,
reality.
but should we arise? Should we get to that point
that
again?
happen? One of the challenges we have in any constitutional order is that power must at some point reside somewhere. Now, in our own constitutional framework, we have determined that the budgeting powers remain primarily with Parliament. And so, in a sense, if Parliament decides to be irrational and unreasonable, that's the price we pay for the members of Parliament we have elected. Obviously, the President has a responsibility. The President is the one who assents to the law, to the bill that, the Appropriations Act, which is the one that provides for how money is going to be spent. He's also the one who's going to assent to the Finance Act, which is the one that talks about how money will be collected. So in a sense, if the President disagrees on the basis of a constitutional basis, he can refuse to assent to the bill. He can refuse to assent to the
But then it still becomes law.
And then what? No, 14 days later.
Yes.
No, he can return. No, he can return it. If he returns it with constitutional issues, then the Parliament would have to override that by a particular majority. So the President has an opportunity there to negotiate, also including using his numbers in Parliament to negotiate for a reasonable bill. But the reality is that if Parliament then by a 2/3 majority decides to override his objections, in a sense we can have a national crisis. But that is a reality that we as Kenyans must also internalize, that these are the people we have elected, these are the people we have chosen to represent us, we have given them those powers, and they can use them irrationally. And it therefore means that when we sit down to vote next time, we probably need to be a little more careful in the sorts of people we vote for, because there are consequences to choices, as we have been told.
I don't know. Anyway,
is
at the end of
David.
it, I'm happy with the outcome, but again, I still think the MPs managed to rustle something out of it, because they didn't lose everything after all. They came back, they got other packs, they got other allowances, which are still, they managed still to extract from the SRC. But the lesson that I would extract from this myself is that people's power seems to have prevailed. The sovereign will of the people outside Parliament seems to have held sway a little. I don't know how long we will, but again, as you say, Parliament has an old manner of characters there. I mean, even people who have elected who are very good. I was shocked at how they were speaking on the floor. I don't want to name names, but really, people went really below their academic. There's nothing to stop them, academic or not, in that house from sinking to certain levels.
You know, when you have a mob, you know, it's very difficult to have reason when in the context of a mob. So it sometimes, you know, like I said, it makes one may not agree with it, but you understand it when you realize that this has to be someone personal benefit. But I think, David, what you say is important. I think we have underrated the role of the public in this whole process. We may call them a bunch of protesters, civil society activists, but the sort of anger that was expressed even in the media by the people who call in, by the polls that the media do, those sort of views, they do affect the way members of Parliament, because members of Parliament ultimately are political animals, and they are very aware of the pulse of the public view. So in a sense,
but how do you
justify?
How do you explain the defiance we saw in the face of the public outrage, you know, against the salaries? They ignored the public.
Yes,
you know, consistently.
Yeah. The reality is that I can bet that if the public had been quiet, and everybody had just kept quiet, and we had all wrung our hands and said, too bad, these people can get away with anything, I suspect that the conclusion we are reaching now is not the one we would have concluded. But it's all part of the process, sometimes, of expressing anger over a decision you don't like.
Okay, so we have to take a break now. This is Cheche, live on Citizen TV. We're dealing with public finances with Commissioner Kamotho Waiganjo of the Constitutional Implementation Commission. Our SMS number is 2442, and the Twitter hashtag is Cheche_TV. When we come back, we focus on the division of revenue bill. We'll be back after the break.